The Intergalactic Institute of Advanced Studies stood as a beacon of knowledge on Zion 4, a planet nestled within the heart of the Andromeda Cluster. Its towering crystalline spires glittered against the dark, star-dappled sky, drawing scholars from every corner of the universe. At the Institute, the highly esteemed Professor vnox was legendary, especially within the Department of Astrophysics. Known for his precise mind and unmatched expertise, vnox's theories on cosmic energy flow and planetary alignment were considered groundbreaking. A towering figure with luminous green skin and an intricate network of glowing lines tracing his forearms, markers of his intellect and rank, vnox commanded immense respect from both his peers and students. The day began like any other, with students filling the grand lecture hall, an enormous space with a vaulted ceiling that displayed real-time star maps from nearby galaxies. Hundreds of eyes, some glowing, some multifaceted, some simply human, turned towards the podium as vnox stepped up, radiating authority. The room hushed. He scanned the hall, silently observing his audience, noting their rapt expressions as they waited for his insights. The professor relished these moments, proud of the knowledge he imparted to his students, knowing he was guiding the next generation of intergalactic thinkers. Professor vnox launched into his lecture, his voice reverberating through the hall as he detailed his latest research on cosmic convergence patterns. Each word was meticulously chosen, each phrase carefully constructed, his teaching style as methodical as the mathematical principles he expounded upon. His lectures were rarely interrupted, as few students dared to question his authority. But today something unexpected lay in store. As he was about to move on to a crucial theorem, he noticed a faint rustle among the students. One figure in the middle row, her head bent over her datapad, seemed absorbed in something other than his words. She was a human student. Elena Moreau. Professor vnox recognized her. She had joined the Institute the previous year as part of an exchange program, one of the few humans admitted into this prestigious academic environment. Like most other aliens, vnox held a certain skepticism about humans. They were often seen as newcomers to the world of advanced intergalactic studies, respected for their adaptability but rarely regarded as intellectual equals among the galaxy's oldest races. Ignoring her, he continued, launching into a detailed explanation of his theory of celestial synchronization. As he glanced down at his own datapad, which displayed the notes he had prepared for the class, he noticed something peculiar. The screen, which normally displayed pristine equations and flawless calculations, had been tampered with. Red annotations and corrections sprawled across the margins. Someone had taken the liberty to mark up his notes. At first, he thought it was a glitch, but as he looked closer, it became clear these were not random marks. They were methodical, precise corrections, pointing out what the author clearly believed were errors in his work. vnox's pulse quickened, and the glowing lines on his forearms shifted to a shade of deep indigo, a sign of his agitation. Who would dare? He thought, his gaze sweeping across the sea of students until it landed once more on Elena. She was looking up at him now, her gaze calm but filled with a quiet intensity. Her datapad was still in her hands, and he could see from the slight frown on her face that she was mentally dissecting every word he spoke. He clenched his jaw, choosing to ignore her presence for the moment, but his mind was racing. Could it be that this human student had the audacity to challenge his theories? He glanced back at his notes, focusing on one of her corrections. She had altered an equation relating to the gravitational fluctuations in binary star systems, noting that he had overlooked a variable that could affect the trajectory of energy flow under certain conditions. It was a minor detail, one that wouldn't change the core of his theory, but the precision with which she noted it was unsettling. As the lecture drew to a close, Professor vnox dismissed the class without his usual parting words. His thoughts were consumed by the annotations he'd just witnessed, and his pride stung at the idea that someone might have found flaws in his work. Just as the students began to gather their belongings, he cleared his throat. "Miss Moreau," he called out, his voice sharp and cold. The entire hall froze, and all eyes turned to Elena, who seemed momentarily surprised before rising from her seat with composed determination. "Yes, Professor," she responded, her voice steady but respectful. "Would you mind explaining what you've done to my lecture notes?" he asked, holding up his datapad with her annotations visible on the screen. His voice was laced with barely contained irritation. Elena's cheeks flushed slightly, but she met his gaze. "Of course, Professor," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I noticed some inconsistencies in the calculations, and I thought it might be helpful to point them out. I apologize if I overstepped." The professor raised an eyebrow. "Inconsistencies, you say?" His tone dripped with sarcasm. "And you believe you're qualified to assess these supposed inconsistencies in my work?" Elena hesitated but nodded. "With respect, Professor, I only intended to offer a different perspective. I understand that my observations might seem unconventional, but they are based on calculations I've reviewed multiple times. I believe they might add clarity to certain points in your theory." A murmur spread through the hall as the students exchanged astonished glances. No one had ever dared question vnox's work, much less publicly. The professor's face darkened as he absorbed her words. It was one thing to silently make corrections in private, but to present them in a way that suggested his work was incomplete. That was an affront he couldn't easily forgive. "Perhaps," he said, his voice ice-cold, "you could enlighten me further, Miss Moreau. Explain precisely where you believe these inconsistencies lie." Elena took a deep breath, her composure steady. "Certainly, Professor. One example lies in your calculation of the quantum energy variance in a binary star system. You assumed a fixed rate of gravitational pull based on average energy outputs, but the system could experience fluctuations if either star had an anomaly in core density. It's a rare condition, but the calculations would yield slightly different results under those circumstances. I adjusted for these variations in the annotations." The silence was palpable. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath as Professor vnox processed her words. For a moment, he was tempted to dismiss her argument outright, but a part of him recognized that she had made a valid point. Her correction didn't nullify his theory, but it did suggest a subtle refinement he hadn't considered. The lines on his forearms dimmed slightly, reflecting his inner turmoil. But vnox was not one to yield easily. "I see," he said finally, his tone clipped. "You believe that incorporating hypothetical anomalies is a sound scientific practice?" Elena nodded, unflinching. "I believe that considering all possible variables, even unlikely ones, enriches the accuracy of any scientific model. Science isn't only about confirming what we know, it's about exploring what we don't." Her words hung in the air, challenging not only vnox but the entire academic mindset of the Institute. He could sense the admiration beginning to form in the eyes of his students, admiration not for him but for the human girl who dared to question him. It infuriated him. Yet he could not find fault in her logic. "Very well, Miss Moreau," he said, his voice a bit softer but still laced with authority. "You have offered your perspective, and while I do not agree with all of it, I recognize the merit in some of your points. For now, I suggest you focus on your own studies rather than on critiquing others. There is much you have yet to learn." Elena nodded, a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. "Of course, Professor. Thank you for considering my perspective." As she returned to her seat, Professor vnox felt a strange mixture of emotions: irritation, confusion, and, somewhere buried deep within, a trace of admiration. This human had unsettled him, but she had also sparked a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. Professor vnox spent the night grappling with an unfamiliar feeling of uncertainty. He'd spent centuries mastering his field, his work revered across countless star systems. The idea that anyone, much less a human student, might expose gaps in his theories gnawed at him. His sleep was restless, punctuated by hazy dreams of equations twisting into incomprehensible symbols and faces in his lecture hall sneering in disbelief. By morning, his irritation had crystallized into resolve. He would summon Elena and demand an explanation for each mark she had made on his work. The professor's office was tucked away in the furthest wing of the Institute's grand astrophysics building. The walls were lined with holoprojectors displaying constantly shifting galactic maps, their swirling stars casting soft, ambient light over the room. He prided himself on the room's orderly design, a reflection of his own logical and methodical mind. Yet this morning, as he arranged his datapads and refreshed his memory on the annotations she had made, there was a lingering tension in the air. When Elena entered, she held herself with a steady confidence. Her posture was respectful, but her gaze was sharp, keenly observant. She was dressed simply, her brown hair tied back in a loose knot, a few stray strands falling around her face. Despite her unassuming appearance, there was an energy about her that was difficult to ignore. "Sit," Professor vnox instructed, motioning to a chair opposite his desk. Elena complied, her expression curious but composed, clearly expecting a rigorous examination of her work. For a moment, the professor simply stared at her, as if weighing the weight of the words he was about to speak. "I reviewed the annotations you left on my lecture notes," he began, his tone icy, "and I find myself perplexed by your confidence in altering theories that have been studied and refined for centuries. Would you care to elaborate on your process?" Elena nodded, leaning slightly forward as she gathered her thoughts. "Certainly, Professor. I respect your work greatly. I wouldn't have made changes without careful consideration. But as I reviewed the material, I couldn't ignore certain variables that, I believe, could significantly impact the calculations in specific scenarios." The professor's eyes narrowed, and he activated his datapad, projecting a hologram of one of her annotated equations. Numbers and symbols glowed faintly in the air between them, her corrections highlighted in red. "This equation here," he said, pointing, "calculates gravitational energy flow in binary star systems. You claim that I neglected the potential for core density anomalies. Do you understand the statistical unlikelihood of such anomalies occurring in stable binary systems?" Elena didn't flinch. "Yes, Professor, I do. But we've observed instances, albeit rare, where unusual density distributions in stellar cores have led to gravitational shifts. Accounting for these outliers, however unlikely, could refine our model's accuracy." He exhaled sharply, suppressing his irritation. "Miss Moreau, if we were to account for every infinitesimal outlier in astrophysical models, we would have chaos, not science. Models require simplifications. They demand order." "But doesn't science also require adaptability, Professor?" Elena countered gently, her gaze unwavering. "If we dismiss certain variables solely because they're inconvenient, we risk missing nuances that could advance our understanding. Besides," she added, a faint smile tugging at her lips, "what's the harm in challenging assumptions, even if only to confirm their validity?" Her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Professor vnox was taken aback. There was an honesty in her curiosity that he hadn't encountered in years. Most students, even those from races with far older scientific traditions, rarely questioned him, content to absorb his teachings without doubt. But this human was different. She seemed genuinely invested, unafraid to challenge concepts if it meant reaching closer to the truth. "Very well," he said, his voice tight. "Let us examine these nuances you seem so confident about. I hope you are prepared to defend your reasoning, Miss Moreau. Let us start with the first equation." Over the next hour, they dissected each correction she had made. Professor vnox pointed out the improbabilities and pitfalls of her adjustments, while Elena defended her perspective, explaining the logic behind each alteration. As they delved deeper, vnox found himself reluctantly impressed by her grasp of the material. She was thorough, prepared, and unapologetically inquisitive. Her arguments were grounded in solid mathematics, though he found her reasoning unconventional. Where he saw stability, she saw possibility. Where he aimed for precision, she aimed for adaptability. They reached a particularly complex segment of the theory involving interstellar energy transfer rates. Elena had altered his equation, suggesting that minor fluctuations in energy dispersion over vast distances could create ripple effects, shifting cosmic currents in ways not yet fully understood. Here, she pointed to the highlighted section. If we factor in the energy ripple effect, it could potentially account for some of the discrepancies we observe in the edge galaxies. It's possible we've been underestimating the impact of minute fluctuations. Vnox raised an eyebrow, his skepticism barely masked. You're suggesting that these fluctuations, which are nearly imperceptible on a local scale, could influence galactic formations? It's not a suggestion, she corrected, her tone resolute. It's a hypothesis. If we continue to dismiss small-scale variables, we limit our understanding of large-scale phenomena. The professor fell silent, contemplating her words. He had spent decades refining his models, perfecting each component to align seamlessly. But what if, in his pursuit of perfection, he had indeed overlooked the subtleties she was addressing? What if his theories, as comprehensive as they were, could be enriched by embracing the unpredictable? It's a dangerous line of reasoning, he replied finally, his voice softer but still guarded. Embracing the unpredictable risks destabilizing what we already know. Or it could illuminate what we don't, she replied, her voice carrying a quiet conviction that was difficult to dismiss. Isn't the purpose of science to explore, even if it means questioning the foundations we're so comfortable with? A faint flicker of doubt crossed Vnox's mind, a rare sensation for a scholar as entrenched in his beliefs as he was. He felt the glow on his arm's pulse, shifting colors as he considered her words. It was a testament to his discomfort, an involuntary display of vulnerability he couldn't entirely suppress. He let out a measured sigh. You've made your point, Miss Morale. I will concede that your corrections introduce interesting perspectives, though I am far from convinced of their necessity. Still, I acknowledge your dedication to the material. Alina's posture softened slightly, a subtle relief washing over her expression. Thank you, Professor. I appreciate your willingness to discuss this with me. As she gathered her things to leave, Professor Vnox hesitated, watching her carefully. Despite his initial reluctance, he couldn't deny that her approach to his work had stirred something within him, a spark of curiosity that he hadn't felt in years. In his unwavering pursuit of precision, had he overlooked the importance of flexibility? Had he allowed his knowledge to become rigid, fixed, incapable of adapting? Miss Morale, he said suddenly, halting her as she reached the door. She turned, her eyes inquisitive. Be prepared to defend your theories rigorously. Many will not share my tolerance for challenges to established work. She nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. I'm aware, Professor, but I believe it's worth the effort. She exited his office, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Vnox remained at his desk, the silence of his office suddenly feeling more oppressive than usual. He found himself returning to her corrections, scrutinizing them with fresh eyes. There was a careful, almost artistic quality to her work, a blend of intuition and logic that resonated strangely with him. He thought back to his own early days as a student, when he'd once possessed a similar drive to challenge his professors, to question the status quo. Somewhere along the way, he had set aside that drive in favor of cementing his theories and maintaining his reputation. But Elena had reawakened that spark, forcing him to confront the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, his understanding of the universe wasn't as complete as he had believed. And as he sat there, alone in the glow of the galaxy maps that adorned his walls, Professor Vnox felt the boundaries of his own knowledge shift, if only slightly. It was a sensation both unsettling and exhilarating, a reminder that even the most established minds could still be taught by the unlikeliest of students. Days had passed since Professor Vnox's encounter with Elena, yet her words lingered with a quiet insistence. She had left more than just annotations in his work. She had left a question mark within his mind, a disconcerting yet thrilling gap in the certainty he had so carefully cultivated. Despite his initial resistance, he found himself drawn back to her corrections, reviewing them late into the night with a curiosity he had not felt in years. The holographic equations she had modified now filled the air of his office, each one highlighted in delicate red script. vnox paced in front of them, scrutinizing each adjustment, running simulations, and calculating the potential effects of her proposed alterations. His usual confidence had been replaced by a rare sense of wonder, his mind crackling with questions. For the first time in centuries, he felt like a student again, his own theories looking unfamiliar and new under the influence of Alina's insights. One evening, as he worked, he received a message from the Intergalactic Institute's chancellor. vnox was invited to deliver a lecture on his most recent work in the Institute's grand auditorium. It was a rare honor, reserved only for the Institute's most distinguished scholars, and his lecture was expected to draw an audience from across the galaxy. Normally, he would have felt only pride, but this time he felt something else, a pang of doubt. How could he present theories that he now suspected might be incomplete? The day of the lecture arrived, and the grand auditorium was packed. The hall's enormous ceiling, painted with constellations from every known galaxy, cast a dim glow over the assembled crowd. Professors, students, and dignitaries from far-flung star systems filled the seats, waiting with anticipation. As he stepped onto the stage, vnox felt the weight of their expectation, a heavy silence settling as he began to speak. The lecture started smoothly. He guided his audience through the foundational principles of his theory on gravitational energy flow in binary star systems, his tone confident and precise. But as he advanced to the equations Alina had annotated, he hesitated. Her corrections now stood out in his mind, like soft murmurs in the background, urging him to acknowledge their presence. He glanced at the audience, his gaze scanning hundreds of faces, until his eyes landed on a familiar one, Alina, seated towards the back, listening intently. She didn't look away when he noticed her. Instead, she nodded slightly, as if encouraging him to continue. Her presence anchored him, a reminder of the conversations that had challenged his perspective. Taking a deep breath, vnox decided to do something unprecedented in his career. He paused, gathering his thoughts before addressing the crowd in a tone that was both measured and earnest. In recent days, he began, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability that surprised even him. I have had the privilege of discussing my theories with one of my students. This student offered insights that, while unconventional, forced me to reevaluate certain aspects of my work. She suggested modifications to my equations, modifications that I was initially reluctant to consider. The audience shifted, murmurs rippling through the crowd. vnox could feel the weight of their judgment, the surprise and curiosity that filled the room. Ignoring his own reservations, he continued. Her insights have reminded me that science, at its core, is not about the pursuit of certainty. It is about the pursuit of understanding, an endless journey of curiosity and adaptation. While my original theories may still hold, I believe they can be enriched by the perspectives of those who see the universe differently, those unafraid to question established norms. With a sweep of his hand, he highlighted one of Alina's annotations on the holographic display, a modification that accounted for fluctuations in binary star systems due to core anomalies. The audience leaned in, eyes widening as they observed the change. Many of them were astute enough to recognize that this adjustment, while subtle, opened new possibilities for understanding cosmic dynamics. As he delved into the revised equations, a strange sense of freedom washed over him. Instead of defending his theories, he was now exploring them alongside his audience, acknowledging the beauty of scientific curiosity over the rigidity of academic pride. His voice softened, becoming more reflective, as he guided the audience through the implications of these newly adjusted models. Alina watched from her seat, a faint smile on her face. She had expected resistance, perhaps even anger, from the professor, but to see him not only accept her insights but share them with others was a gesture of humility she hadn't anticipated. She felt a swelling of pride, not just for herself but for vnox, who had chosen the path of openness over ego. The lecture concluded with a round of applause that filled the hall, echoing off the domed ceiling. For the first time in his career, vnox felt that the applause wasn't just for him, it was for the spirit of inquiry, for the courage to embrace growth, and for the recognition that even the most accomplished minds could learn from those they might otherwise overlook. After the crowd began to disperse, Elena approached the stage, her steps hesitant. vnox, still standing by the holographic display, looked down at her, a faint smile breaking through his typically stern expression. "Miss Moreau," he said, inclining his head slightly in acknowledgement. "Your annotations have proven to be enlightening." Elena's cheeks flushed, but she met his gaze with a respectful nod. "Thank you, Professor. I only hoped they would be helpful." "They were more than helpful," he replied, his tone genuine. "They reminded me that knowledge is a journey, not a destination. I have spent so long perfecting my theories that I forgot the importance of challenging them. You have reminded me of this, and for that you have my respect." Elena's face lit up, a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "It was an honor, Professor. I didn't expect you to be so open to my suggestions." vnox chuckled softly, a rare sound that seemed to surprise even him. "Neither did I. Perhaps there is more I have yet to learn, even about myself." They shared a quiet moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. vnox, a scholar who had once viewed knowledge as something to be defended, had learned that wisdom came not from knowing but from seeking, from challenging, and from embracing the perspectives of others. As he walked away from the lecture hall, vnox felt a lightness he hadn't felt in years. His footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, and he realized that his journey, once thought complete, had only just begun. He was no longer bound by the need for perfection. Instead, he was free to explore, to adapt, and to grow. And as he glanced up at the stars painted on the ceiling above, he felt a newfound connection to the vastness of the universe, a universe that, in all its complexity, was never meant to be fully understood, but rather eternally explored.